your food rules for IBS take on a new meaning and a role in your health. This week, I'm talking about Bethany, a previous client of mine who had SIBO and had been previously advised to give up gluten and go low carb. And as a young person living at home with her parents, I also engaged with them and they were worried that she wasn't eating enough food. This week's episode of the Inside Knowledge podcast, we're going to hear about how we tackled the symptoms of her SIBO. She was getting bloating and pain alongside supporting her overall health. This is a case study about managing stress, disordered eating and SIBO. So if you're not up for hearing about restrictive eating, maybe skip this week. Welcome to episode 102 of the Inside Knowledge podcast for people with IBS. I'm Anna Mapson. This episode is about SIBO, and I love doing the case study episodes, and I think you enjoy hearing them as well, just hearing how we've managed to work and what they have found difficult, because I know that you probably find these things difficult too. Now, this case is not one where we got to the end of 3 months and things had resolved significantly, and I will explain a little bit about why in today's episode. So let's get into it. Bethany had already seen a nutritional therapist before she came to see me, and they'd had 2 positive SIBO tests over the last few years. What they were looking for is some help understanding SIBO, understanding how to treat it, because despite having 2 positive tests, she just hadn't been able to change her symptoms, and the person that she was working with had given her a plan that hadn't made any impact on her symptoms. So the person she worked with previously told her to go low carb. They actually told her to go on the Carnivore diet for 2 weeks and then to be low carb. Listen to episode 66 of my podcast if you want information about the keto or carnivore diet. But in there, I explain a lot about how going completely low carb, and actually the carnivore diet is meat only. So you are removing all other foods. That's anything with any vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, any fiber, of course. I don't think it's a good idea. And she really struggled to follow it for 2 weeks as well, because it's kind of heavy eating a lot of just meat and nothing else. Anyway, she did that. What I was also kind of surprised about is that the previous practitioner hadn't treated the SIBO. So that was the position. She came to me with bloating, gas, and erratic stools. So mostly on the constipated side, but occasionally it would get really mushy and sort of a type 6 on the Bristol stool chart. So they came to see me, her and her parent, because they were looking for some help with the SIBO and they just wanted to get it treated. They also just wanted somebody who was really knowledgeable about IBS and only worked in that area, which is often why people come and see me. They don't just want a general nutritionist. The first things that I worked with Bethany on was trying to unpick some of the previous education about the role of carbs and fiber for our diet, about the role of gluten, because she'd also been told that gluten was damaging her gut. Biggest stumbling block in this case, and why I wanted to mention it, was that there was a bit of education I had to do with the family around the role of carbs and the role of fiber in the diet. But also Bethany had lost a bit of weight when she went low carb, and she was worried that eating carbohydrates again would make her feel fat. When you are in a smallish body and you get really bloated, sometimes that can lead to people really becoming quite overly aware of their stomach and the size of it. And she was resistant to eating more carbohydrates because she thought it was making her fat. And I'm going to come back to this. But this was one of the biggest stumbling blocks in this case. There was a few things that I had to do with the family to try and help to educate them and try and work with them on the SIBO. And then I'll go into a little bit about, how it went and what kind of changes she was able to make. So I talked to the family definitely about gluten is not damaging for your gut. Yes, high quantities of wheat can be really triggering for gas. And if you're eating toast and sandwiches and pasta all day, every day, and just lots of wheat-based carbohydrates, then it's very possible you can be having too much wheat. But it's much more likely in cases of IBS that it's actually the fructan, that's the FODMAP element, the starchy element of the wheat, that is a problem for you, not gluten. So I was not rushing them on this, but just tried to sort of support them on how to understand the role of gluten in the body. I also was keen to get her off a low carb diet, especially off the carnivore diet, because I don't think this is a helpful diet for anybody because of the increased levels of saturated fat and also the lack of fiber, but also particularly for this person, she was active. She also had high levels of stress and anxiety, and going completely low carb, I think will negatively affect your energy balance and maybe lead to increased symptoms of stress. So it puts us into that fight or flight mode when you just don't have enough energy to keep going. The other thing that was really important to me to work with them on was treating the SIBO. So she had 2 positive tests when she came to work with me and had not been given any treatment for the SIBO. It's not going to go away on its own. Actually, what she found was the first test, she had high hydrogen. The second test, which was a few years later, she had hydrogen and methane. So the way that this can happen is that when you have very high uncontrolled levels of hydrogen gas in your small intestine, then that can encourage methane producing microbes to grow, because the methane producing microbes eat up some of the hydrogen gas. They use that as a substrate. So what happens is the more uncontrolled hydrogen you've got, which the symptom wise is gas, bloating, pain, sometimes diarrhea. Those are really common symptoms for SIBO. But then you can end up with methane growth as well, because the bugs are enjoying this high level of hydrogen gas. So that was the kind of core educational work, was trying to get off a low carb, treating the SIBO, and not being terrified of gluten. Some of the ways we worked was trying to get in 3 more substantial meals. So the other thing that Bethany was really struggling with was craving chocolate at night and just feeling like she needed to eat sugary foods at night. And I think this was really driven by a lack of carbohydrates during the day. Your body does need some level of glucose to keep going. It's good to have a balanced diet that includes protein, it includes healthy fats. We do need some level of glucose in the diet. And because she was so restricted on carbs, she was really craving sweets and chocolate at night. I think this can be very common as well when you are feeling stressed and anxious. Partly it's your body trying to get an available source of glucose, which is needed in high stress situations. Your body is going to look for quick energy release when you're in a chronic state of fight or flight. That's a natural way to help the body prepare for danger, like for the fighting or running or whatever. So managing stress is a really big part of managing cravings for some people. There's lots of reasons why we eat. Sometimes we eat for emotional reasons, which is not always bad. It's okay. But when it becomes the only way to process your emotions, that's when it can lead to some issues in terms of your dietary balance and what you're actually eating. I started off encouraging her to eat some potatoes because she was really excited about eating carbs, but very nervous. So she started off just having a small amount of potato with her normal evening meal, which was low carb kind of meat and then some low carb vegetables. So the carefulest way to add it in was just adding in like 1 small little potato. How did it go? That went fine. She felt okay. And then she kind of got overexcited and started making extra things at the weekend, like she made some pancakes, then she had some toast for lunch. She started to feel like overly relaxed about the carbs because she'd had a good experience for a few days. Now, what happened then was she suddenly got a lot more bloated and felt, oh my God, carbs are really bad for me. They're not working. It's not helping. And so this is where we do need to be slow and careful with these reintroductions, especially if it's a food that you haven't eaten for a long time. You almost need to train your body up. Listen to episode 101, which I recorded last week about sugar intolerance. And I mentioned in there, if you're not eating certain types of carbohydrate, your body may not produce those enzymes that break it down as readily. So you can just train up your tolerance over time by slowly increasing the amount and gradually reintroducing foods. I don't suggest launching into eating really carby meals if you've never eaten carbs for a year. Okay, so that was the small dietary changes, and that was quite a big learning point for me, I guess, as well, about being very clear about the way I suggest that she introduced the foods. Just because she'd had a good few days with potato did not mean that suddenly all carbs were going to be fine straight away. So we spent a bit of time working on that. Every time I do these with people, I learn something else. Always a learning curve working with people. Remembering I said she needed to treat the SIBO. So I suggested some antimicrobial herbs that are known to help reduce SIBO that I've used before with lots of people. And the purpose of that was to try and get on top of the bloating at the same time as trying to work on the diet to help to regulate her bowel movements, to help to regulate her energy intake. That was the dietary goals. And then from the perspective of supplements, I was helping her to reduce the SIBO and also focusing on adding in good bacteria. But I didn't do this through adding in any live probiotic bacteria. I didn't think it would be appropriate at this stage. But she did start with some PHGG, which is partially hydrolyzed guar gum. It's a prebiotic fiber that is low FODMAP. In some places it's sold as sun fiber. You might see it in the States. That is normally well tolerated and can help people when they're low carb to just add in some prebiotic fiber that is non-fermentable, and it tends to be quite well tolerated. So you can start with 1/4 of a teaspoon, very, very small amounts, and just gradually increasing your dose. If you've listened to the podcast before or seen my website, you'll know that I work in a kind of cogs model. We have 4 main cogs that I think all interlink and all help to change your health one small step at a time. So we want to turn the cogs, turn the machinery bit by bit, and for everybody they will have different levers and things that they're going to pull to try and get things into motion, try and get your digestion settled, calm and naturally flowing well. One of the main cogs that I think about is lifestyle. So that includes sleep, exercise, movement of any kind really, and managing stress. I think I mentioned a few minutes ago that she did have quite high anxiety and stress, but she was very reluctant to do anything about it. She had another issue that she'd been going to the doctor about that wasn't related necessarily to her digestion, and the doctor thought it was potentially stress related and suggested some talking therapy. But she was very loath to do that and didn't want to do the talking therapy. I'd also suggested trying to do some mindfulness to calm down and to try and feel more peace and more slowness in her life. And she said she was too busy to do mindfulness, too busy to sit down for 10 minutes and do the calming activity. That definitely feels true sometimes for me as well. I have times when I feel, oh my God, I just haven't got 10 minutes to sit quietly and do some stretching or do some calm breathing. My life is too full and too busy. But those are normally the times when it's most important to do it. And I have to remind myself that. So I definitely understand the resistance that I felt to all of these suggestions. So I did suggest that she would get benefit from following the talking therapy suggestions from her doctor. And I was sort of trying to encourage her small ways to feel more mindful, even if you can't sit in complete stillness and quietness for 10 minutes doing a perfect meditation practice. Like, that's not necessary, but maybe you can have a peaceful walk at lunchtime to just go around the block, look at some trees, try and look at some greenery and just feel calm that way. Maybe you can sit with your dog and really focus on calmly stroking your dog and just trying not to be distracted by other things. Like, it's okay to be mindful in different ways. So that was something that we talked about. But I think it was interesting that there was this sort of high level of underlying stress that felt too difficult to deal with. Something I think we have to be aware of is like, why do we not want to deal with these big stressful things? Is there something going on or something that you feel a resistance to addressing? So that can be really hard when you feel like you want to get help, but the things you're being told to do, you don't feel like ready for. That's frustrating. Okay, so where did we get to? Bethany was starting to get some improvement. So about halfway through the 3 months, she was getting more regular bowel movements. She wasn't constipated. The bloating was up and down, I would say. It didn't really resolve. And then we were talking about how to introduce more of the lower FODMAP foods to increase the carbohydrate element. So the low FODMAP foods that you can introduce that contain carbs as potatoes, oats, and rice. These are known to be less fermentable than other grains and whole grains and pulses and things that have fiber in. But she was quite negative about increasing her carbohydrate intake, even though they were low fermentable foods that were less likely to cause a problem. And actually, she didn't have a digestive reaction to these carbs, but did have a psychological reaction. So she felt as soon as she ate any carbs that she was putting on weight. And at the same time, the parent that was sometimes attending the sessions felt that she wasn't eating enough food. When someone in your family has a concern that you're not eating enough and you have a resistance to a whole food group because you feel like it's going to put on weight, I think that is a point where it's worth considering, where is the elimination being driven from? Is it really about the digestive issue, or is there something about your weight that's actually driving it? She was able to introduce more vegetables, more fiber containing foods, but she really struggled with carbohydrates, and not because they were giving her digestive issues, but because she felt that they were potential for her to put on weight. She was a normal, healthy weight. She was active, and the weight gain that she was talking about was very minimal. So again, this is another maybe trigger to think about, is if you are obsessing about a kilo here or there, or a couple of pounds here or there, what difference does it actually make to your life if you have put on 2 pounds? Does this really impact on your life? Does it mean that your friends think differently of you, that your enjoyment of your job is different, that your relationships are any different? Bethany had given up carbs on the advice of a previous nutritionist, and that had led to some improvements in her digestion in the short term. But then she got a little bit constipated. And as she was starting to reintroduce the carbs, even when we did it quite slowly, she still had in the back of her mind that it was going to make her put on weight. I could tell it wasn't necessarily a digestive issue. Actual weight on the scale wasn't really changing. And because she was at a healthy weight, even if she had gone up by a pound or two, it wouldn't have made any difference. A good question to ask yourself would be, would I be happy to put on 1 kilo or a couple of pounds and completely get rid of my digestive issues? Or is the maintenance of this particular body size or getting smaller more important to me than resolving my digestive issues? Sometimes it's not an either or situation. However, it is a good question to ask yourself, because if you are restricting foods that will help your digestive process because of a fear of weight gain, then that is a choice that you're making. I'm not saying that you have to eat potatoes and bread and pasta in order to be healthy, but it's very hard to get sufficient energy to not end up really craving sugar and sweets, and to not constantly think about food because you are restricting a good source of glucose and energy that your body can easily use. Okay, it's not 100% essential for you to eat carbs to be healthy, but if you're in a place where your digestion is erratic and irregular, maybe you would benefit from eating a more balanced diet that will give your body more of what it needs. Something to think about anyway, if you're someone who's worried about eating carbs, not for the digestive reasons, but because of potential weight gain. So where did we get to with Bethany? The way we left it was that she was having daily bowel movements and they were mostly a lot easier. So the constipation had gone. And that was a combination of using magnesium. I think she used psyllium husk as well for a short time. She was definitely using that PHGG. She'd worked on the SIBO with the antimicrobial herbs. Now, what I didn't get her to do was another test. And that was because they just didn't have the money to do a retest. And I really wish we could have done, because to show that the levels were coming down would have potentially helped them to keep going with the plan. So where we'd left it was that they were going to think about pursuing a SIBO test through the doctor if they could manage that, because you can get it on the NHS in some health areas. So in terms of a resolution, I guess I was a little bit worried about sharing this case because it doesn't wrap up with a nice, easy solution. Yes, everything was better. She was great. But I wanted to share it because I notice with a few clients that I work with that there is this constant dynamic between trying to get away with as little food as possible and also wanting to optimize your gut health at the same time. So yes, you want to have a good, healthy gut, and you've probably done lots of research about gut health. But on the other hand, you've absorbed a lot of information that carbs will lead to weight gain, that sugar is really, really bad for you and should be avoided at all costs. So it's really hard to balance these two opposing views, really. And that is where working with somebody to make it specific to you can be helpful. I would have loved to see Bethany take up the offer of some talking therapy through her doctor. I think that would have been really helpful. Most of the clients who I work with who are also prepared to work on their mental health get the most benefits out of changing their diet and lifestyle when they can also get some help with managing their emotions. I would have really loved to see her do another SIBO test so that we could have checked in on the gas levels and see where she needed to do like the next round of treatment. And I would also love to have worked with her a little bit more on her relationship to food, because I don't think she was really in the right place to do that at the time she was working with me. But I think it would have been really helpful if we'd have had longer together to be able to do that. So the reason I shared this case study, like I said, was just to maybe highlight for you, if you're out there and struggling with restricted eating and how that might have influenced your relationship with food, is just to ask yourself that question that I mentioned about what's the priority for you right now, and also to think about where you might be able to get some support if you feel like that is an issue for you. A good place to start would be going to your doctor and mentioning that you're having some struggles, but you can also look for talking therapy to talk about your relationship with food, or finding an eating disorder specialist would be a good place to start. I'll leave it there for this week. Thanks very much for listening to this case study episode of the Inside Knowledge podcast. Better digestion for everyone.